The alarm did not wake me. The silence did. I had fallen asleep with the drill hammer still running 2 levels below, the steady thump of it a lullaby I had grown used to over 8 months on New Terra. When it stopped, my eyes opened on their own, the way they do when something in the world has quietly gone wrong, and your body knows before your mind does. I lay still in the dark of the crew bunk, listening. Nothing. No hum of the ventilation fans. No distant clatter of the ore carts. No voices from the mess hall 2 corridors over. My name is Cale Ferris, and on that morning, I was 26 years old, an engineer assigned to Tunnel 7 of the New Terra Deep Excavation Project. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. New Terra was not a fortress. It was not a military outpost bristling with weapons, daring the galaxy to test it. It was a colony of dreamers. 40,000 of us had crossed 11 light years on a converted cargo hauler to build something new, something ours, on a rust-colored world, with 2 moons and soil rich enough to grow wheat within a single season. We had a school. We had a bakery that opened at 5 in the morning and filled the central dome with the smell of fresh bread. We had a girl named Ivy who played violin on the observation deck every evening, and half the colony would stop what they were doing just to listen. We were not a threat to anyone. That is the part I need you to hold on to, because it will matter later. I pulled on my boots and climbed out of the bunk, moving through the dark toward the tunnel access ladder. My comm bracelet was dead, its little light refusing to blink no matter how many times I tapped it. That alone should have terrified me. The colony network never went down. Command had redundancy built into redundancy, 3 separate power grids feeding the communications relay, because Administrator Owen Pratt had insisted on it during construction. He used to joke that he had grown up on a farm where the power flickered every time it rained, and he was not about to let his new home be at the mercy of a single failed wire. I climbed the ladder 2 rungs at a time, my breath already quick in my chest, though I could not have told you why. Something in the air felt wrong, a pressure behind my ears, like the whole world was holding its breath. The hatch at the top of Tunnel 7 led into a small maintenance alcove with a reinforced viewport, installed so inspectors could check the surface conditions without fully surfacing during a dust storm. I reached the viewport and looked out, expecting to see the pale morning light of New Terra's sun breaking over the ridgeline, expecting to see the solar collectors catching the first rays, expecting to see, at the very least, the world I had gone to sleep in. Instead, I saw fire falling from the sky. Not the way a meteor falls, streaking and brief. This was slower, more deliberate. Long lances of white and orange light, descending in careful, measured lines, as if something up there was taking its time, making sure it did not miss. I watched one of those lines strike the central dome, the dome where the bakery was, where Ivy played her violin, where the school had just finished its morning assembly. The dome did not simply break, it folded inward, and then it was gone, along with the ground beneath it, along with everything and everyone who had been standing there a moment before. I did not scream. I want to tell you I did, because that would make me sound more human. But the truth is that my throat simply closed, and I stood frozen at that viewport for what felt like an hour, and was probably only 10 seconds, watching my home cease to exist 1 building at a time. Above the colony, so high they were only glints of silver against the brightening sky, I could make out shapes, ships, dozens of them, arranged in a pattern too clean, too patient to be anything but deliberate. They were not firing wildly. Each strike landed exactly where it was meant to land, methodical, unhurried, the way a person might clear a table of clutter they had grown tired of looking at. That was my first encounter with the Calith Dominion. Not a handshake, not a treaty, not even a shouted warning. Fire from a clear sky, aimed by something that did not consider us worth the courtesy of an explanation. I would learn later, much later, what had happened in the weeks before that morning. The Dominion had sent a single envoy ship to New Terra almost a month earlier, a sleek black vessel that hovered above the colony for exactly 1 hour before broadcasting a message in a flat, translated voice. The message said that New Terra sat within a resource band claimed by the Dominion centuries before humanity had even developed spaceflight, and that our colony was, in their words, an unauthorized occupation. It gave us 30 days to evacuate, or submit to what they called integration. Administrator Pratt had done what any reasonable leader would do. He sent the message back to Earth through the relay buoy, requesting instruction, requesting support, requesting anything at all. Earth's response had come back within a week, calm and reassuring. Diplomatic channels were being opened. A delegation was being prepared. Colonists were advised to remain calm and continue normal operations while the matter was resolved through proper channels. Proper channels. I think about those two words more than almost any other words in my life. We trusted them. We trusted that somewhere far away, people smarter and more powerful than us were handling things. The way you trust that the ground beneath your feet will hold. The way you trust that when you turn on a light switch, the light will come on. We did not know, could not have known, that the galaxy the Dominion ruled did not operate on proper channels. It operated on power and demonstration, and the swift removal of anything that failed to answer fast enough. 30 days came and went. The delegation from Earth was still in transit, still 11 light-years away, still weeks from arrival. And on the 31st day, the Dominion decided that our silence, our simple continued existence, was answer enough.
I do not know how long I stood at that viewport.
Long enough that my legs began to shake beneath me, long enough that the tunnel behind me had gone completely silent, except for my own ragged breathing. Somewhere below, I heard footsteps, quick and uneven, someone half running, half stumbling up through the access shafts. It was Mira Doyle, a geologist who worked the eastern face of the tunnel, her hair loose from its usual braid, her eyes wide and unfocused in a way I had never seen on her before. She grabbed my arm so hard I felt her nails through my sleeve.
"Kale!"
she said, her voice cracking on my name.
"What is that sound?"
I had not even noticed the sound until she said it, but once she did, I could not unhear it. A low, rolling roar, felt more in the chest than heard through the ears, the sound of the sky itself being torn apart somewhere above the rock over our heads. I do not know, I told her, which was true, and also the last honest thing either of us would say for a long while, because after that, nothing about what was happening made sense enough to explain in simple words. We moved deeper into the tunnel, away from the viewport, away from the hatch, following the same instinct that makes an animal burrow when the storm comes. Others found us as we went, drawn by the sound of our footsteps or simply following the same buried impulse to go down, to go where the rock was thick and old and might, just might, stand between them and whatever was happening above. By the time we reached the lower junction, there were 9 of us. 9 out of 40,000. I want to tell you their names, because I think it matters that you know them, that you understand. These were not statistics. They were people who had packed their whole lives into single crates and crossed the dark between stars to build something new. There was Mira, who I have already told you about. There was Owen Pratt himself, the administrator, who had been doing an early inspection of the tunnel supports when the strikes began, and whose face I will never forget, gray and still, like a man watching his own life's work being erased in real time. There was a young man named Dax, barely 19, who kept repeating his sister's name under his breath, over and over, a rhythm instead of a prayer. There was an older woman named Colette, who had been a school teacher back on Earth, and had come to New Terra to help build the very school that no longer existed above us. There were 4 others whose faces I remember clearly, and whose names I will not list here, because this is already becoming difficult enough to tell. We did not speak much, not at first. There was nothing to say that would not sound foolish against the sound still echoing through the rock above us, strike after strike after strike, the Dominion methodically finishing what it had started. It was Owen who finally broke the silence, his voice steadier than I expected, though I could see the effort it cost him. He said one word: beacon. The deep tunnel network had its own emergency transmitter, installed for exactly the kind of disaster nobody ever expects to actually happen: a cave collapse, a toxic gas pocket, anything that might trap miners below the surface and cut them off from the colony's main communication grid. It was never meant to reach across the stars. It was meant to reach the surface relay station, half a kilometer away, which would then bounce the signal up to the orbital buoy and out into the wider network that eventually reached Earth. If the surface relay station still stood, we had a chance. We moved through the lower tunnels toward the emergency transmitter room, 9 sets of footsteps hurrying through the dark, following emergency lighting that flickered against walls, still trembling faintly from impacts above. I remember Mira's hand finding mine at some point during that walk, gripping it so tightly it hurt, and I did not pull away, because I think we both needed something solid to hold on to, that was not made of rock. The transmitter room was small, barely large enough for the equipment itself, and 2 people standing beside it. Owen took the controls without hesitation, his hands moving with the practiced calm of a man who had run drills for this exact scenario a dozen times, never once believing he would need to use them for real. The screen above the transmitter flickered, then steadied, then displayed a single word in faded green text. Connected. Owen looked back at the rest of us crowded into the doorway, and for the first time since the strikes began, something like hope moved across his tired face. "We are still here," he said quietly. "That is the whole message. That is all we need to send. We are still here." He began recording, his voice low and even, stating the colony designation, the time, the nature of the attack, the number of survivors known at that moment. He did not embellish it, did not add fear or anger to his words, and somehow that made it worse, made it more real, hearing a man describe the end of everything he had built in the flat, careful tone of someone reading a technical report. I stood in that doorway and listened to him speak, and I thought about Ivy and her violin, about the bakery and the smell of fresh bread at 5 in the morning, about a school that had opened its doors for the last time that very morning, without any of us knowing it. I thought about how quickly a world can end, and how strange it is that the universe does not pause to acknowledge it, that somewhere above us the Dominion's ships continued their slow, patient work, as if nothing of consequence had happened at all. Owen finished the recording and sent it. The green light on the transmitter blinked once, twice, confirming transmission, and then the screen went dark. We did not know, in that moment, whether the signal had actually reached the relay station, whether the relay station itself had survived long enough to bounce it further, whether anyone on Earth would ever hear those words at all. All we could do was wait, crowded together in a tunnel half a kilometer beneath a world that no longer had a surface worth returning to, and hope that somewhere, 11 light-years away, someone was listening. I did not know then that the message would reach Earth. I did not know that it would arrive not as a distant tragedy to be mourned and filed away, but as the first spark of something the galaxy had never seen before, and would spend the rest of its history trying to understand. I only knew, in that dark and trembling tunnel, that I was alive, that 8 of my neighbors were alive beside me, and that everything else I had known was gone. The roar above us continued for nearly 2 more hours before it finally stopped. When the silence came again, it was worse than the sound had been, because silence meant it was over, and over meant there was nothing left to save. Colette was the one who began to cry first, softly, her hand pressed against her mouth, as if she could hold the sound in. Dax stopped repeating his sister's name, and simply sat down against the tunnel wall, his knees pulled to his chest, staring at nothing. Mira did not let go of my hand. I did not cry, not yet. I think some part of me was still waiting for someone to tell me it was a mistake, that the strikes had been a warning, a demonstration, and that the colony was still there, damaged but standing, waiting for us to climb back up into the light. I think I needed to see it with my own eyes before I could let myself believe it. Owen must have understood that same need in himself, because after nearly an hour of silence, he stood, brushed the dust from his knees, and said that someone needed to check the surface access, if only to confirm the relay station's status, and see whether the beacon signal had truly gone out, before everything above us was lost. I volunteered before I had fully decided to. Mira came with me, her jaw set in a way that told me arguing would be pointless. We climbed back through the access shafts we had descended hours before, the rock around us settling into an eerie stillness, dust drifting down from the ceiling in slow, lazy spirals where the impacts had loosened it. When we reached the maintenance alcove with its reinforced viewport, I hesitated at the ladder for a long moment, before finally forcing myself to climb the last few rungs and look out. There was no colony left to see. Where the central dome had stood, there was a wide, blackened crater, still faintly glowing at its edges. The solar collectors were gone. The bakery, the school, the observation deck where Ivy used to play, all of it reduced to a landscape of scorched rock and drifting ash beneath a sky the color of an old bruise. In the far distance, barely visible through the haze, I could make out the twisted remains of the surface relay station, its transmission mast bent nearly in half, but, I thought, perhaps still standing. Mira pressed close beside me at the viewport, and neither of us said a word for a long time. There was nothing to say that would not sound small against what we were looking at. Behind us, in the tunnels below, 7 other people waited in the dark, alive because of an accident of timing and location, because a drill hammer had happened to be running late into the night, because a group of engineers had happened to be underground when the sky opened up and erased everything above them. I did not feel lucky. I felt like a splinter left behind, after something much larger had been torn away. I want to tell you, because I think it matters, that in that moment, I did not think about revenge. I did not think about the Dominion at all, not really. I thought about Ivy's violin, and whether it had survived, buried somewhere in the ash, and I thought about how strange it was that something so small and fragile could matter so much to me in the middle of something so vast and terrible. It would be a long time before I understood that our small, buried transmission, those few careful words Owen Pratt had spoken into a dying microphone, had already begun to travel outward into the dark between stars, carrying with it the first thread of a response that would, in time, reshape everything the galaxy believed about the quiet, unassuming species it had just decided to erase. But that night, in the tunnel, none of us knew any of that yet. We only knew that we were alive, that our home was gone, and that somewhere far above us, the ships that had done this were still moving slowly across a sky that no longer belonged to anyone we knew. I sat with my back against the cold rock wall, Mira beside me, Owen a few feet away with his head bowed, and for the first time since the alarm that never came, I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. It came in waves, first disbelief, then a grief so heavy it felt physical, pressing down on my chest, until breathing itself became an effort. None of us slept that night, if it was even still night by then. Time had lost its shape somewhere between the first strike and the silence that followed. We sat together in the dark, 9 survivors of a colony that had held 40,000 souls that morning, and we waited, because waiting was the only thing left that we knew how to do. Far above us, unseen and unknown to any of us in that moment, our message was already crossing the void, carrying the truth of what had happened toward a homeworld that would not answer with proper channels, or delegations, or careful diplomatic language. It would answer with something the galaxy had never once had to reckon with before. But that story belongs to what came next. Word travels strangely across the dark between stars. It does not move the way sound moves through air, in a single steady wave, growing fainter with distance until it fades away completely. It moves in relays, in bursts, passed from buoy to buoy, from station to station, each handoff adding delay, each delay adding uncertainty about whether the message will ever complete its journey at all. Our small transmission from the tunnels beneath New Terra had 11 light-years of that uncertain journey ahead of it, and none of us, huddled together in the dark, had any real hope that it would arrive whole, let alone arrive in time to matter. But it did arrive. And I have since had the chance, through channels I never expected to have access to learn exactly how it was received on the other end, in rooms far from that tunnel, by people who had spent their careers hoping they would never have to hear a message like it. The relay buoy orbiting New Terra had survived the attack, badly damaged but functional, its outer hull scorched, and half its solar array torn away, yet its core transmission systems intact. It caught our signal in the final hour, before its remaining power reserves failed completely, and it did what it was built to do. It threw the message outward, toward the nearest deep space relay station 8 light-years away, a lonely outpost called Meridian Point that existed for exactly this purpose, to catch whispers from the edge of human space and pass them home. Meridian Point's overnight communications officer was a woman named Priya Nakamura, 23 years old, 6 months into her first deep space posting, more accustomed to routine status pings from survey ships than anything resembling an emergency. She has since told her own account of that night publicly, and I have listened to it more than once, because it is strange and humbling to hear a stranger describe the moment she first learned that my home no longer existed. She said the signal came through garbled, fragments of Owen Pratt's voice breaking apart and reassembling across the relay chain, static swallowing whole syllables before the automated systems cleaned enough of it to render comprehensible. She said the words that finally resolved on her screen were New Terra, attack, casualties unknown, and that she sat frozen for nearly a full minute before her training reasserted itself, and she flagged the transmission as priority emergency, routing it directly toward Earth, without waiting for confirmation, without waiting for a supervisor, without waiting for anything at all. That decision, made in under 60 seconds by a young woman most of humanity has never heard of, saved perhaps 2 or 3 critical hours in a chain of events where every hour mattered. The message reached Earth's deep space communications hub roughly 3 weeks later, still incomplete, still fragmented, but unmistakable in its meaning. By the time it was fully reconstructed and verified, Earth's government had already begun quietly activating protocols that had existed, mostly theoretical, mostly unused, since the earliest days of humanity's expansion beyond the solar system. I did not witness any of what happened next with my own eyes. I only know it through the accounts given later, through records made public in the aftermath of everything that followed, and through the strange, unsettling calm with which Earth's leadership is said to have received the news that one of humanity's colonies had been erased without warning by a power none of us had ever formally met. The report was delivered to a joint session of Earth's Unified Council, the closest thing our fractured, still occasionally quarrelsome species had to a single governing body for matters that concerned us all as a whole. Present in that session, according to records later released, was Councilwoman Elena Voss, who chaired the Council's Foreign Relations Committee, and General Marcus Hale, who at the time held command over what the public knew only as the Deep Response Fleet, a name so deliberately unremarkable that most citizens assumed it referred to little more than a coordination office. Elena Voss is said to have read the reconstructed transmission twice before speaking, her expression, according to 2 separate witnesses in that room, giving away nothing at all. When she finally spoke, her words were reportedly simple. She asked General Hale a single question. Is the fleet ready? I think about that question often, not whether retaliation was justified, not whether diplomacy might still resolve things peacefully, not even, in that first moment, whether more information was needed before deciding on a course of action. Simply, is the fleet ready? As though the answer had already been decided long before that morning, and the only remaining question was one of logistics. I did not understand, until much later, what General Hale's fleet actually was, or how long it had existed in near total secrecy. Humanity, it turned out, had learned certain lessons from its own history, that it had never fully unlearned, even generations after leaving Earth's atmosphere and scattering itself among the stars. Lessons about what happens when a species assumes peace is guaranteed, simply because it is wished for. Lessons about the cost of being unprepared, when someone else decides that peace no longer serves them. In the decades before New Terra's destruction, quietly, without public announcement, without the fanfare that usually accompanied Earth's peaceful exploration initiatives, a portion of humanity's resources had gone toward building something the wider public was told very little about. Officially, it was a defensive research initiative. Unofficially, among the small circle of officials who understood its true scope, it was something closer to an insurance policy against exactly the scenario that had just occurred. General Hale's answer to Councilwoman Voss, according to the same witnesses, was equally brief. Yes. What followed over the next several days was not chaos, not the frantic scrambling one might expect from a species suddenly confronted with the murder of 40,000 of its own people. It was, from every account I have since gathered, unnervingly organized. Ships that had existed for years in quiet orbital shipyards, monitored by only a handful of personnel, began receiving activation orders. Crews who had trained for a mission they never truly expected to fly began reporting for duty. Supply chains that had been maintained at low but constant readiness for over a decade began moving toward full capacity. I have since spoken, briefly, with one of the officers who received those orders, a woman named Freya Lindquist, who served as a tactical officer aboard one of the vessels mobilized in that first wave. She told me that when she opened her orders and read the words New Terra Colony, status confirmed destroyed, she did not feel anger first. She felt something closer to a terrible, quiet clarity, the sense that a question she had trained her entire career to answer had finally, after all those years of preparation, become real. She also told me something I have never forgotten. She said that humanity's military doctrine, the one drilled into every officer who served aboard those quietly built ships, was built around a single guiding principle, one that had emerged not from arrogance or aggression, but from humanity's own painful history of underestimating threats, until it was too late to respond proportionally. The principle was simple to state and terrible in its implications. When diplomacy fails and violence is chosen for you, do not answer in kind. Answer in a way that ensures the choice is never made again. I did not know, sitting in that tunnel with 8 other survivors, that such a doctrine even existed. I did not know that Earth had spent so long quietly preparing for a day it hoped would never come. All I knew, in those first weeks after the attack, was that we had been found, eventually, by a search and rescue vessel that arrived nearly a month after the destruction, drawn by the same beacon signal Owen Pratt had recorded in that trembling underground room. The vessel was called the Meridian's Hope, a modest transport ship never designed for combat, crewed by volunteers who had heard the news of New Terra and demanded to be among the first to reach any survivors. I remember the moment their landing craft touched down near the crater that had once been our central dome, the hatch opening, and a young medic named Callum Reyes stepping out into ash, still drifting faintly on the wind, his face pale, as he took in the scale of what remained. He found 9 of us waiting at the surface, having finally emerged from the tunnels once our supplies ran low enough that staying below was no longer survivable either. I remember him asking, gently, how many of us there were, and I remember Owen Pratt's voice, hoarse from weeks of near silence, answering him. 9, he said. 9, out of 40,000. Callum did not say anything to that. I do not think there was anything to say. He simply nodded, and began helping us aboard. And it was only once we were in the air, rising away from the ruins of everything we had built, that I finally allowed myself to cry, silently, staring down at the blackened landscape shrinking beneath us. We were taken first to a medical station orbiting a nearby system, then eventually transferred toward Earth itself, for what the official records called debriefing, though it felt, to those of us who lived through it, more like being slowly, carefully put back together by people who had no idea how deeply we had been broken. It was during that long journey home that I first began to hear whispers, careful and half-informed, among the crew of the transport carrying us, about what was happening elsewhere in human space, about ships moving, about a fleet gathering somewhere near the edge of known territory, about something the crew referred to only as the response, spoken in tones that mixed grim satisfaction with something almost like dread. I did not fully understand then what that response would come to mean. I did not understand the scale of what Earth was preparing to do, or the doctrine that had shaped it, or the years of quiet, patient construction that had led to this moment. I only knew that somewhere far behind us, my home lay in ruins, and somewhere far ahead of us, something enormous had begun to move. I would learn, in time, that the galaxy itself had no idea what it had just set into motion. The Dominion had destroyed New Terra, believing it was disciplining an insignificant, unproven species, one among countless others it had subdued or erased over the long centuries of its rule. It had no framework for understanding a species that did not measure the cost of retaliation the way it measured such things. A species whose history was scarred deeply enough by its own conflicts that it had built, quietly and deliberately, an answer to exactly this kind of moment, and had simply been waiting, hoping never to need it. Somewhere in that long, quiet transit toward Earth, staring out at the stars through a reinforced viewport not unlike the one I had once looked through to watch my home burn, I began to understand that the story of New Terra was not going to end where I had assumed it would. It was not going to end in grief alone, in 9 survivors carried home to tell a story no one else would ever fully understand. It was only the beginning. By the time our transport reached Earth's outer defense perimeter, I had stopped counting the days. Grief has a way of erasing time, folding it in on itself, until you can no longer say with certainty whether an hour has passed or a week. I remember the strange, disorienting relief of seeing Earth itself through the viewport for the first time in my life, a swirl of blue and white and green that I had only ever known from photographs and stories passed down from grandparents who still remembered it firsthand. I remember thinking that it should have felt like coming home, and instead it felt like arriving somewhere entirely foreign, a world I had no memory of, and no right to claim as mine. We were met not by cameras, not by crowds, not by any of the fanfare I might once have imagined would greet the survivors of humanity's first colonial disaster. Instead, we were met by a small, quiet group of officials and medical staff, and by a man I did not recognize at the time, but would come to know well over the following months. A mid-ranking intelligence officer named Julian Voss, no relation to the councilwoman I mentioned earlier, though the coincidence of the shared surname struck me even then as strange. Julian's role, I would learn, was to gather first-hand accounts from survivors, not for public record, but for something closer to a full intelligence assessment. He was gentle in his questioning, careful never to push too hard, always pausing when Colette's voice broke, or when Dax simply stopped speaking mid-sentence, and stared at the floor for long, silent minutes. But beneath that gentleness, I could sense something sharper, a hunger for detail that went beyond simple sympathy. He wanted to know everything, the number of ships, their formation, the pattern of the strikes, the exact wording of the Dominion's original ultimatum, which Owen Pratt had, thankfully, kept a full copy of in the colony's administrative records, before those records were lost, along with everything else. It was during one of these sessions, nearly 2 weeks after our arrival, that Julian finally told me something of what was happening beyond the walls of the quiet medical facility where we were staying. He told me, carefully, in the measured tone of someone unsure how much a grieving survivor could bear to hear, that Earth had not remained passive in the wake of New Terra's destruction. He told me about the fleet. I want to be careful here, because I did not witness what he described with my own eyes, not directly, not in that moment, but I have since had the accounts confirmed many times over, by officers, by historians, by the eventual public record released, once secrecy no longer served any purpose. And so I will tell you what I came to understand, in the weeks and months that followed, about what Earth had built in the quiet decades before New Terra ever existed. Humanity, it turned out, had never fully trusted the peace it found once it began expanding beyond its own solar system. Not because it distrusted the other species it encountered specifically, but because it distrusted the very idea of guaranteed safety, an idea that our own history had taught us, again and again, was never as solid as it appeared. Earlier generations of humans had built empires and watched them fall. They had signed treaties and watched them broken. They had trusted in the goodwill of others and paid terrible prices for that trust, more times than any single record could fully capture. So when humanity finally reached the stars, a quiet faction within Earth's leadership, one that included, even then, a much younger Elena Voss and a much younger Marcus Hale, argued for a different approach. Not aggression, not conquest, but preparation, thorough and unyielding, against the possibility that the galaxy beyond our solar system might not welcome us with the open arms our early explorers hoped for. That preparation took the form of what came to be known, in the small circles that understood its true purpose, as the Deep Response Fleet. Ships built not for exploration, not for trade, not even primarily for defense of Earth itself, but for a single, terrible purpose that its architects hoped would never need to be used, to answer, decisively and without hesitation, any act of aggression severe enough to threaten humanity's continued existence among the stars. Julian told me that the fleet's doctrine had been debated fiercely in its early years, that many within Earth's government had argued against building something so overwhelming, so final in its implications, fearing it would make humanity itself the aggressor the galaxy needed to fear. But the counter-argument, the one that ultimately won out, was rooted in something that I, having watched my home burn from a tunnel half a kilometer underground, understood with a clarity that no argument could have given me before. The counter-argument was this: a species without the capacity to answer overwhelming force with overwhelming force is not a peaceful species. It is simply a target, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. I did not know, in the weeks following New Terra's destruction, the full scale of what that fleet contained. I did not know about the shipyards hidden in the quiet dark beyond Neptune's orbit, staffed by rotating crews sworn to secrecy, building vessels whose true capabilities were known only to a handful of engineers and officers. I did not know about the doctrine of proportional overwhelm, a strategy so different from anything the wider galaxy practiced that it would, in time, become the very thing that defined how other species understood humanity forever after. What I did know, sitting across from Julian Voss in that quiet debriefing room, was that something enormous had already begun to move in response to what happened to us. He told me, carefully, that the fleet had received activation orders within days of the beacon signal reaching Earth. That ships which had waited in dark, silent orbit for years, some for decades, were now moving toward a rendezvous point near the edge of human space. That crews who had trained for a mission they hoped would remain purely theoretical were now preparing for something real. I asked him, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, what that mission actually was. He hesitated before answering, and I remember the careful way he chose his words, as though even he was not entirely certain how to explain something so far outside the framework of what most people understood war to mean. He said that Earth was not preparing to negotiate. He said that Earth was not preparing to demand an apology, or reparations, or any of the careful diplomatic gestures that might have satisfied a more conventional grievance. He said that Earth had made a determination, quietly, coldly, and with a certainty that unsettled even those who had helped shape the doctrine that led to it, that the star system responsible for ordering New Terra's destruction would cease, in the near future, to pose any threat to anyone ever again. I did not fully understand, in that moment, what those words truly meant. I think some part of me assumed it referred to a military campaign, a series of engagements, perhaps a prolonged conflict fought over months or years, the kind of drawn-out war I had read about in old historical records from Earth's own troubled past. I did not yet understand that humanity's doctrine had no interest in prolonged conflict, that the entire purpose of the Deep Response Fleet, built quietly over decades, funded through means the public would only fully understand much later, trained through simulations more extensive and more ruthless than anything any other species in the galaxy had ever developed, was to make prolonged conflict entirely unnecessary, to end a war so quickly, so completely, that no drawn-out campaign would ever be required. Julian told me one more thing before that session ended, something that has stayed with me every day since. He told me that the fleet's commanders had reviewed every detail of the beacon transmission, every word Owen Pratt had spoken into that dying microphone, every account the surviving colonists had given since our rescue. He told me that my own account, given in an earlier session, describing the methodical, unhurried pattern of the strikes, the way the Dominion's ships had taken their time, treating the destruction of 40,000 lives as a simple matter of clearing unwanted clutter from a table, had been included in the official mission briefing, distributed to every ship in the fleet. I did not know how to feel about that. Part of me felt a strange, uncomfortable pride, that my words, spoken in grief and exhaustion, had somehow become part of something so much larger than myself. Another part of me felt only a deep, cold dread, understanding for the first time that what was coming would not be small, would not be careful, would not be contained in the way that a more cautious species might have chosen. In the days that followed, I was told that I, along with a small number of other survivors, had been asked to serve in an advisory capacity aboard the fleet's flagship, not as combatants, but as witnesses, as living testimony to what had happened, should any question arise about the justification for what was about to occur. I said yes before I had fully considered what that would mean. I think, looking back, that some part of me needed to see it through to the end, needed to stand at the edge of whatever was coming, and bear witness to it, the way I had been forced to bear witness to the destruction of my home. I did not want revenge, not exactly. I am not certain, even now, that the word revenge fully captures what I felt. What I wanted, more than anything, was for what happened to New Terra to matter, to mean something beyond 9 survivors and a blackened crater on a world that no longer had a name anyone outside our small community would remember. I did not yet know how much it would come to mean. I did not yet know that the response Earth was preparing would not simply avenge New Terra, but would reshape, permanently and irreversibly, the way every species in the galaxy understood the quiet, unassuming world called Earth. But I was about to find out, because within a month of that conversation, I found myself aboard a vessel unlike anything I had ever imagined humanity capable of building, watching through a viewport far larger and far clearer than the one I had once used to watch my home burn, as the edge of Dominion space came slowly, inevitably into view. The ship that carried me toward the edge of Dominion space was called the Solace, and I remember thinking, the first time I heard its name spoken aloud, that it felt like a strange choice for a vessel built for what it was about to do. I would learn, later, that the fleet's ships were almost all named this way, quiet, gentle names that gave no hint of the capability they carried. There was comfort in that, I think, for the crews who served aboard them, a small reminder that they had not built these vessels out of hunger for conquest, but out of grief and fear, and the quiet determination never to be caught unprepared again. Aboard the Solace, I met people who would become, in the strange, compressed way that shared crisis creates bonds, some of the closest companions I have ever known. There was Freya Lindquist, the tactical officer I mentioned earlier, whose calm certainty steadied me more than I ever properly thanked her for. There was a young pilot named Soren Callis, barely 22, who had grown up hearing stories about the quiet fleet from his father, a retired engineer who had helped design its earliest vessels, and who had enlisted the moment he was old enough, hoping, as so many aboard that ship hoped, that he would never actually need to use his training. And there was Admiral Grant Ashworth, who commanded the Solace, and, by extension, the larger response fleet gathering around it. I did not speak with him often during those early weeks, but I remember clearly the first time I did, called to a small briefing room to once again recount, in careful detail, everything I had witnessed the morning New Terra was destroyed. Admiral Ashworth was not a large man, nor an especially imposing one in appearance, but he carried a stillness about him that filled the room more thoroughly than volume ever could have. He listened to my account without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. He told me that he had reviewed the beacon transmission dozens of times, had studied every available record of the Dominion's original ultimatum, had spoken personally with 3 of the other survivors before me. He told me that in all his years of training and preparation for exactly this scenario, he had never expected the reality of it to feel so different from the simulations, so much heavier, so much more permanent. I asked him, because I needed to know, whether what was about to happen could still be avoided, whether there was still a path towards something other than what Julian Voss had described to me weeks earlier back on Earth. He answered honestly, which I have always respected him for, even now. He told me that diplomatic channels had, in fact, been attempted, quietly and without public knowledge, in the weeks following New Terra's destruction. A formal message had been sent to the Dominion's regional authority, demanding acknowledgement of the attack, demanding an accounting for the lives lost, demanding, at the very least, a formal explanation. The response, when it finally came, was 3 words long. It said, in essence, that the matter was already resolved. I remember the way Admiral Ashworth's jaw tightened slightly as he repeated those words to me, the only visible sign of emotion I saw from him during that entire conversation. He told me that the Dominion's dismissive response had confirmed something the fleet's command structure had suspected from the very beginning, that this was not a misunderstanding, not an isolated incident born of miscommunication, but a demonstration, deliberate and calculated, meant to remind humanity of its place within a galactic order that had existed, largely unchallenged, for longer than our species had even possessed the technology to leave our own solar system. He told me that the Dominion, and likely much of the wider galaxy, viewed humanity the way an old, established power views a newcomer that has not yet learned the rules, worthy of neither negotiation nor genuine consideration, only correction, applied swiftly and without hesitation. Whenever that newcomer failed to submit quickly enough to expectations it had never been given the chance to properly understand. I asked him what humanity's response would demonstrate instead. He was quiet again for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before, something between resolve and something that felt almost like sorrow. He said that humanity's response would demonstrate a single, simple truth, one that the Dominion, and every other power watching from the shadows of galactic politics, would need to understand clearly and permanently, that a species which responds to peaceful expansion with unprovoked destruction should not expect to face a proportional consequence. It should expect to face a consequence so complete, so absolute, that the very possibility of repeating such an action against humanity again would cease to exist. I did not fully grasp, in that moment, exactly what such a consequence would look like in practice. I understood the words, understood the doctrine behind them, but I had not yet seen what humanity's quiet decades of preparation could actually accomplish when finally set into motion. That understanding came gradually over the following weeks, as the Solace and the ships gathering around it moved steadily closer to the border of Dominion territory. I was given, during that time, a degree of access to the fleet's operations that I had not expected, largely, I believe, because Admiral Ashworth understood that my presence aboard the ship served a purpose beyond simple advisory testimony. I think he wanted a witness who would understand, fully and completely, the weight of what was about to happen, someone who could carry that understanding forward, long after the mission itself concluded. I watched, from the observation deck of the Solace, as the fleet's true scale finally became visible to me for the first time. Ships that had existed in scattered secret shipyards for years, decades in some cases, converged into a single, coordinated formation, stretching further than I could properly comprehend. I counted vessels until I lost track of the number, and Freya, standing beside me during one of these long observation sessions, told me quietly that what I was seeing represented only a portion of the fleet's total strength, that additional vessels remained in reserve, positioned to respond should the initial engagement require reinforcement. I asked her whether she believed reinforcement would be necessary. She shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the distant formation outside the viewport. She told me that the Dominion, for all its long history of dominance over the species within its territory, had never faced an opponent that approached conflict the way humanity did. She told me that most species the Dominion had subdued over the centuries fought defensively, reactively, hoping to preserve as much of their strength as possible in anticipation of a prolonged occupation or negotiated settlement. Humanity, she said, did not fight that way. Humanity's doctrine, born from a history soaked in the lessons of half-measures and prolonged, unresolved conflicts, treated hesitation itself as a form of failure. When the decision to respond had finally been made, when every diplomatic avenue had been exhausted and dismissed, the fleet's entire purpose was to apply overwhelming, decisive force in a single, coordinated action, ending the conflict as swiftly and completely as possible, precisely because prolonged conflict was understood to cost more lives, not fewer, no matter how carefully it was managed. I thought about New Terra as she spoke, about the methodical, patient way the Dominion's ships had carried out their attack, treating the destruction of 40,000 lives as an unhurried, almost administrative task. I thought about the stark difference between that approach and what Freya was describing now, a response built not around patience or careful escalation, but around the absolute certainty that hesitation itself was a danger to be eliminated as thoroughly as the threat it responded to. In the final days before the fleet crossed into Dominion territory, Admiral Ashworth called a final briefing, one I was permitted to attend alongside the senior officers of the Solace and several other vessels connected remotely through secure channels. I remember the room falling completely silent as he outlined the mission's objective, his voice steady, his words carefully chosen, though I could sense, even then, the enormous weight he carried in delivering them. The target, he explained, was not simply the fleet responsible for New Terra's destruction, though that fleet would certainly be engaged and, he stated plainly, would not survive the engagement. The target was the star system from which the attack had been ordered and launched, a heavily fortified Dominion stronghold that served as both a military shipyard and an administrative center for the region of space bordering human territory. I remember the phrase he used to describe the mission's ultimate goal, a phrase that has stayed with me ever since, repeated in my mind more times than I could ever properly count. He said that the fleet's objective was to ensure that the star system in question would never again pose a threat to humanity, or to any species within reach of its influence, for as long as human history continued to be written. I did not fully understand, in that briefing room, the true scope of what those words meant. I would understand soon enough, because within days, the Solace and the vast formation surrounding it crossed the border into Dominion space, and the response that Earth had spent decades quietly preparing finally, irreversibly, began. I remember the moment we crossed into Dominion territory, not as a dramatic shift, not as some grand cinematic instant marked by alarms or announcements, but as something almost anticlimactic in its quiet. A soft chime sounded through the Solace's corridors, a simple notification that the fleet had passed the recognized border, and for a long moment, nothing about the ship's atmosphere changed at all. The crew continued their duties with the same steady focus they had carried for weeks. Soren Callis remained at his station, hands resting lightly on his controls, his expression calm in a way that unsettled me more than panic would have. It was Freya who finally spoke, standing beside me at the observation deck, her eyes fixed on the star field ahead, where distant points of light marked the outer edges of the system we were approaching. She told me that the calm I was witnessing was not indifference, it was discipline, built through years of training so thorough that even a moment as significant as crossing into enemy territory became simply another procedural step in a sequence the crew had rehearsed more times than any of them could count. I asked her whether the Dominion knew we were coming. She told me that they almost certainly did, that a fleet of our size could not cross into contested space undetected, and that the Dominion's forces stationed within the system ahead had very likely already begun preparing their own response. I asked her whether that concerned her. She was quiet for a moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same steady calm I had come to associate with everyone aboard the Solace. She told me that the Dominion's preparation, however extensive, was built around an understanding of conflict, shaped by centuries of engagements, against species that fought defensively, cautiously, hoping to preserve their strength. She told me that whatever defenses the Dominion had mustered in the days since detecting our approach, they had almost certainly not prepared for what our fleet actually represented. I did not fully understand what she meant until the engagement itself began, several hours later, as the Solace and the ships surrounding it entered the outer edge of the system Admiral Ashworth had identified as our target. I will not pretend to have understood, in real time, the full tactical complexity of what unfolded that day. I was not a soldier, not a strategist, only a survivor, given a seat near enough to witness history as it happened. But I remember watching, through the reinforced viewport of the observation deck, as the Dominion's defensive fleet emerged from the shadow of the system's largest planet, a formation that Freya, standing tensely beside me, estimated at nearly triple the size of what our own forces had anticipated encountering. For a brief, terrible moment, I felt the same cold dread I had felt watching fire fall from the sky above New Terra, certain that we had underestimated the scale of what we were facing, certain that history was about to repeat itself in some new and terrible form. That fear did not last long. Admiral Ashworth's voice came over the ship's internal comm system moments later, calm and measured, issuing a series of commands that meant little to me in the moment, but that Freya later explained represented a coordinated engagement protocol the fleet had drilled extensively during the long weeks of transit. Our ships did not charge forward recklessly, did not attempt to overwhelm the Dominion's larger formation through sheer aggression. Instead, they moved with a precision that felt almost mechanical in its coordination, spreading into a pattern designed specifically to neutralize the numerical advantage the Dominion's forces believed they held. I watched as the first exchanges began, distant flashes of light against the black backdrop of space, each one representing, I understood only later, the destruction of a vessel and everyone aboard it. I will not describe the details of that engagement in the way a military historian might, because that is not the story I am equipped to tell, and because I think the specific mechanics of the battle matter less than what it revealed about the difference between the two forces facing each other that day. The Dominion fought the way it had always fought, the way it had fought against every other species it had subdued or intimidated into submission over the centuries of its dominance, relying on numbers, on the assumption that overwhelming force applied broadly would eventually break any opponent's resolve. Our fleet fought differently, applying force with a precision and coordination built not from arrogance, but from a species that had spent generations learning, often through painful experience, that careless application of strength cost more than it gained. Within hours, though it felt to me, standing frozen at that viewport, like it lasted for days, the Dominion's defensive formation had been reduced to scattered fleeing remnants, its once overwhelming numbers no longer sufficient to mount any coherent resistance against a fleet that had never once wavered from the coordinated pattern it had drilled for years to execute perfectly. I remember Freya's hand finding my shoulder at some point during those hours, steadying me, though I do not think either of us could have said with certainty which of us needed the steadying more. What followed the destruction of the Dominion's defensive fleet was, in many ways, more difficult for me to witness than the battle itself had been. The Solace and the ships around it advanced deeper into the system, toward the fortified world that served as the Dominion's regional stronghold, the very world from which the order to destroy New Terra had originated. I was not present in the tactical command center during the final phase of the engagement, and I am grateful, even now, that I was not asked to be. What I know of that final phase, I know from accounts given to me afterward by Freya, by Soren, and eventually by Admiral Ashworth himself, in a conversation that took place many weeks later, once the mission had concluded, and the weight of what had happened had settled into something we could each begin, slowly, to carry. The fortified world was not destroyed carelessly, not in the methodical, unhurried manner the Dominion had used against New Terra. Every account I have gathered since agrees on this point. The fleet's engagement was swift, precise, and directed specifically against the military and administrative infrastructure that had made the world a threat in the first place. The shipyards, the command centers, the fortifications that had allowed the Dominion to project its power across the region for so many generations. I understand that this distinction may feel small, may feel like a fine line drawn after the fact to soften something that remains, at its core, an act of overwhelming destruction. I have thought about that distinction many times since, and I do not offer it now to excuse what happened, only to explain it as accurately as I am able, because I believe the truth matters more than a comfortable simplification in either direction. What I know, with certainty, is that by the time the engagement concluded, the star system that had ordered the destruction of my home no longer possessed the capability to project military force beyond its own borders. Its shipyards, the source of the fleet that had glassed New Terra from orbit, no longer existed. Its command infrastructure, the administrative apparatus that had issued the original ultimatum and later dismissed our demand for accountability, in 3 cold words, no longer existed either. I remember, days later, once the fleet had begun its slow withdrawal from Dominion space, standing once again at the observation deck of the Solace, looking out at stars that no longer felt quite as distant or as indifferent as they once had. Freya joined me there, as she often did during those quiet hours, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. It was Freya who finally broke the silence, her voice quieter than I had heard it during the entire mission. She told me that she did not feel triumphant, despite everything the fleet had accomplished. She told me that she felt, instead, a heavy, settled grief, not for the enemy we had faced, but for the fact that such a response had ever needed to exist at all, that humanity had been forced, by its own painful history, and by the actions of a power that had never once considered us worth the courtesy of negotiation, to become capable of exactly what we had just demonstrated. I understood, standing beside her in that quiet observation deck, that the story of New Terra had reached its most terrible and most consequential chapter. But I understood, too, that the story was not yet finished, because word of what had happened in that system was already beginning to spread outward, through the same relay networks that had once carried our small, desperate beacon signal toward Earth, and the galaxy that had dismissed humanity as an insignificant newcomer was about to learn, in full and unmistakable terms, exactly what it had provoked. The news reached the wider galaxy faster than I expected, though I suppose I should not have been surprised. Information, like fire, tends to spread fastest through the driest ground, and the ground across Dominion-controlled space, I would soon learn, was dry with fear that had been quietly accumulating for far longer than any of us realized. I did not witness the initial reactions firsthand, but I have since gathered accounts from officers who monitored intercepted communications during the weeks following the engagement, and from a small number of neutral diplomatic contacts who later reached out to humanity once the full scope of what had happened became clear across multiple systems. What emerges from those accounts is a picture of a galaxy caught completely off guard, not merely by the destruction itself, but by the sheer disbelief that a species so recently dismissed as insignificant could execute a response so swift, so coordinated, and so absolute. Freya shared with me, during one of our long conversations aboard the Solace as the fleet made its slow return toward human space, a summary of one intercepted transmission that had circulated widely among neighboring systems in the days following the engagement. It came from a minor trade delegation stationed near the border of what had been Dominion territory, and its tone, she told me, was less a formal diplomatic report than something closer to a frightened warning passed quietly between contacts who had, until recently, viewed humanity as barely worth tracking. The delegation's report described the destroyed system not through detailed military analysis, but through the simple, unsettling observation that a fleet believed to be one of the Dominion's most secure regional strongholds had ceased, within the span of a single engagement, to function as a military or administrative power at all. It noted, with what Freya described as evident alarm, that the response had come not from a rival empire seeking territorial gain, but from a species whose only demonstrated interest, prior to that moment, had been peaceful expansion and modest colonial settlement. I think that detail, more than any other, unsettled the galaxy most deeply. A conquering power, expanding aggressively and seizing territory, fits within a framework that older, more established empires understand instinctively, because it mirrors their own history. But a quiet, previously unremarkable species, one that had shown no prior interest in conquest, responding to a single act of unprovoked aggression with total, decisive consequence, and then withdrawing without attempting to claim or occupy the territory it had just secured, fit no framework the galaxy possessed at all. That last detail matters, I think, more than almost anything else I can tell you about what followed. The fleet did not remain in Dominion space. It did not attempt to seize the destroyed system, did not establish an occupying force, did not demand tribute or territorial concession from the wider Dominion structure that remained. Once its objective had been accomplished, once the specific threat responsible for New Terra's destruction had been permanently removed, the fleet withdrew entirely, returning to human space as swiftly and quietly as it had departed. I asked Admiral Ashworth, during that later conversation I mentioned, why the fleet had not pressed its advantage further, why humanity had not used the opportunity to expand its influence or secure additional territory from a clearly weakened regional power. His answer has stayed with me ever since, and I believe it captures something essential about the doctrine that shaped everything I witnessed during those months. He told me that humanity's response was never meant to be about conquest, or territorial ambition, or even, strictly speaking, about revenge in the way that word is commonly understood. He told me that the entire purpose of the mission was to establish, permanently and unmistakably, a single principle that the wider galaxy would now have no choice but to understand. That humanity, however new, however unfamiliar with the older customs of galactic power, possessed both the capability and the unwavering will to answer unprovoked aggression with a consequence so absolute that repeating such an act would never again be considered worthwhile. He told me that a species seeking conquest invites endless further conflict, because conquered peoples resist, rebel, and remember. A species that demonstrates only the willingness to answer aggression decisively, and then withdraws without seeking further gain, sends a very different message, one that is, in its own way, far more unsettling to a power built on centuries of assumed dominance. It tells the wider galaxy that humanity is not interested in expansion through force. It tells them that humanity is, and will remain, exactly what it always claimed to be, a species seeking peaceful coexistence among the stars. But it also tells them, unmistakably, what will happen to anyone who mistakes that peaceful intention for weakness. I did not fully appreciate the weight of that distinction until the fleet returned to human space, and I finally had the chance to see, through the careful reports compiled in the weeks that followed, how quickly and how thoroughly the galaxy's understanding of humanity began to shift. Diplomatic contact requests, once rare and often dismissive in tone, began arriving from species and political structures that had previously shown little interest in formal relations with Earth. I read summaries of several of these early communications, and what struck me most was not any expression of hostility or resentment, but rather a careful, almost anxious formality. Delegations eager to establish clear boundaries and mutual understanding, none of them willing to risk even the smallest miscalculation that might provoke a response similar to what had befallen the Dominion stronghold. I remember a particular exchange, relayed to me by Julian Voss, during a visit he made to check on the surviving colonists once we had all returned safely to Earth, involving a neutral trading consortium that had, for years prior, treated human traders with a kind of polite condescension, offering unfavorable terms and dismissing complaints without serious consideration. Within weeks of the engagement becoming widely known, That same consortium reached out with revised proposals, notably more generous, accompanied by careful diplomatic language emphasizing mutual respect and long-term partnership. Julian told me, with a wry, tired smile, that humanity had not sent a single additional ship, had not issued a single additional threat, had not needed to. The engagement itself, and more importantly, the doctrine it revealed, had done the work entirely on its own. I think, looking back, that this is the part of the story the wider galaxy found most difficult to process. Not the destruction itself, terrible as it was, but the discovery that humanity's capacity for such destruction existed alongside, rather than instead of, a genuine desire for peaceful coexistence. The Dominion and its allies had assumed, based on centuries of experience with other conquering powers, that any species capable of the kind of decisive, overwhelming force humanity had demonstrated must, by necessity, be driven by similar ambitions of dominance and expansion. What they found instead was a species that seemed to want nothing from the galaxy beyond the simple right to exist peacefully within it, and that had proven itself entirely willing to accept an enormous cost, both in resources and in the moral weight carried by everyone who had participated, in order to secure exactly that right. I do not think the galaxy ever fully learned to feel comfortable with that contradiction. I have spoken, in the years since, with a small number of representatives from other species, diplomats and traders, who have visited Earth as relations slowly normalized, and nearly all of them, when the topic arises, describe a similar unease, a sense that humanity cannot be easily categorized within the frameworks the galaxy has relied upon for so long to understand the powers that shape it. We are not conquerors, and yet we have shown ourselves capable of ending, absolutely and without hesitation, any power that mistakes our patience for weakness. We are not isolationists, and yet we do not seek the kind of expansion that has defined every other significant power the galaxy has known. We are, in the words of one particularly candid diplomat I spoke with years later, an unresolved question the galaxy has learned to answer very, very carefully. I think about New Terra every day, even now. I think about Ivy's violin, about the smell of fresh bread at 5 in the morning, about Owen Pratt's steady voice recording our final message into a dying microphone in a tunnel that no longer exists. I think about the 9 of us who survived, and the 40,000 who did not, and I think about the strange, terrible weight of knowing that our loss became the reason an entire galaxy learned to fear, and eventually, cautiously, to respect, the quiet, unassuming species that built its home among the stars, not out of ambition, but out of hope. That hope cost us everything, once. It very nearly cost us everything again, but it did not break us, and in the end, it was that same hope, carried forward, through grief and fire and the long, patient work of people who had spent decades quietly preparing for a day they hoped would never come, that ensured no other colony would ever again be dismissed so easily, or destroyed so carelessly, by a power that assumed silence meant weakness. I do not know what the galaxy will make of us in the centuries still to come. I do not know whether the peace that followed New Terra's destruction will hold, or whether some new power, somewhere among the vast dark between stars, will one day make the same fatal miscalculation the Dominion once made. But I know this much, with a certainty I carry with me every day since I climbed out of that tunnel and looked out over the ruins of everything I had known. Humanity did not choose to become the galaxy's nightmare. It was made that way, forged in grief and quiet resolve, by a power that mistook our patience for weakness and paid a price it could never have imagined. And somewhere out among those same stars, I believe, countless powers still watch us carefully, still choose their words with care, still remember, whether they wish to or not, exactly what happened the day a human fleet answered the destruction of a single quiet colony, by ensuring, permanently and completely, that it would never happen again. I still keep a small, damaged fragment of Ivy's violin, recovered years later from the ash that once covered New Terra's central dome. I keep it not as a symbol of what we lost, though it is certainly that, but as a reminder of what that loss ultimately protected. Every colony, every settlement, every quiet, hopeful community humanity has built among the stars since, all of them standing now beneath a galaxy that has finally, fully understood the cost of mistaking our peace for permission.